Hi, I'm Henry Bonsu, and you're listening to The Threshold, a podcast from Foreign Policy about how to end infectious diseases and the innovations that could get us there. Today, we're focusing on what could eliminate tuberculosis. TB claimed more than 1.25 million lives in 2023, overtaking COVID as the world's deadliest infectious disease.
COVID actually had a very negative impact on TB.
This is Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. She is the Principal Advisor on Tuberculosis for the Health Ministry of India, and she was the Chief Scientist for the World Health Organization from 2019 to 2022, during the height of the COVID pandemic. Soumya says that before COVID, TB incidence had been declining.
For about 15 to 20 years, the world had been making good progress in terms of both identifying more TB patients and linking them to treatment. Deaths had been coming down.
But health service disruptions during COVID hit TB hard, particularly testing, which dropped dramatically.
There were a lot more missed cases, which means that there were also more deaths and probably more transmission of TB going on in the community.
Thankfully, TB rates are starting to decline again, and Soumya thinks that with the right technological breakthroughs, we could end TB in the near future.
I think it's very much feasible to imagine that we would eliminate TB in the next 10 or 15 years.
We'll hear more from Dr. Soumya Swaminathan later in the show about how TB could cease being a public health threat. Another way of saying that, how could we get below the threshold for TB, the point where the infectious disease might actually die out? And yes, that's why we call this podcast The Threshold. You just had to wait 4 episodes to hear it. Anyway, for those of you unfamiliar with tuberculosis, here are a few quick facts. Tuberculosis, or TB, is a contagious disease caused by bacteria. It spreads through the air when someone with active TB coughs, sneezes, or speaks around others, kind of like COVID. While TB usually affects the lungs, it can also attack other parts of the body, like the kidneys or the spine. For the last 100 years, there has been a vaccine protecting children from tuberculosis. Now there is hope for a new solution, a potential TB vaccine for adolescents and adults. And it's being tested in 7 countries, including South Africa, one of the world's TB epicenters. Elna Schütz reports from South Africa.
Worcester is a small South African town nestled in between mountains, an hour or so outside of Cape Town. It's famous for its cultural history and winemaking, 2 things that unite people. But everyone I speak to here at the local research clinic talk about one more tragic thing they have in common.
2 of my neighbors. One survived, she's still around, but my other didn't survive. We lost him last year.
My mother had the normal TB in the lungs at first, but she survived it. But now she has TB meningitis.
I was exposed to TB when I was a child because my own father had TB.
Everyone here has lost or nearly lost someone to tuberculosis. TB is a problem throughout South Africa. Around 56,000 people die of it a year across the country. Even though I have not had the disease myself, there's a significant chance that I have the latent infection in my body just by living here. I know enough people who have had it, including in my family, to know it's always a possibility. In Worcester, the rates are particularly high, which explains why the subject of TB comes up a lot here, and also why Worcester is an ideal place to study solutions. The people I talk to are part of a groundbreaking clinical trial for the M72 TB vaccine. Each person taking part in the study has received either the vaccine in 2 doses or a placebo.
I'm not scared. The procedure is you come in, you sit, you see a sister first, they write in.
Rubenisha Williams comes into the busy clinic regularly for simple checkups.
Secondly, go see the doctor. And thirdly, they're taking the blood, and then you're finished.
She is one of around 20,000 people across 7 countries that are enrolled in this phase 3 trial. That means the vaccine has already been tested for dosage, safety, and efficacy. At this stage, it's being tried on a large group of different people over several years to make sure it works well. The M72 AS01 vaccine, that's its formal name, was developed by the British pharmaceutical company GSK. It's made up of 2 antigen proteins, meaning it has purified parts of the TB bacterium in it.
Why we are excited about that? Because we haven't seen such a strong signal with almost 50% efficacy in reducing TB cases.
Angelique Luabeya Kany-Kany is the Chief Research Officer for the South African TB Vaccine Initiative, SATVI, who are running part of the trial here in Worcester.
Today we are in a follow-up phase, which means we see the participants now every 6 months. Participants are coming, telling us, okay, what was their life within the last 6 months, if they have any illness, if they have any TB symptoms.
These follow-ups are expected to continue till about 2028. The trial leaders think phase 3 will take about 3 to 4 years, largely because they need to wait for enough participants to be exposed to the risk of TB. This is the only way they can test the vaccine's efficacy in comparison to the placebo. Plus, they're seeing how M72 works over time and making sure the results are safe for different people. The smaller phase 2 trial took about 3 years as well. In short, it takes a while. Back in the city at the University of Cape Town, I asked SATVI's director, Professor Mark Hatherill, a question that you listeners might be asking yourself right now. Why do we need a TB vaccine? I thought I already got one.
We do have one.
You might recognize the indented oval pea-sized scar that some people have on their arm. That's likely from the Bacillus calmette-guerin, or BCG vaccine.
We have a vaccine called BCG, which is given to babies at birth all over the world. And BCG works. But the issue with BCG is that it doesn't last.
While the BCG vaccine brings protection during childhood, it often wears off in adulthood. And the disease tends to develop and spread amongst adolescents and adults. This is why a new TB vaccine for this age group could be transformative. While there have been various vaccine candidates for TB over the last century, it's a complex disease to develop a successful solution for, and it often doesn't get the financial resources it needs, which is why a successful vaccine for adolescents and adults would be a game changer.
M72 is probably the most exciting hope that we have for an effective vaccine that is nearest rollout.
M72 had a more than 50% efficacy rate in its phase 2B trial, which is what the World Health Organization guidelines say a vaccine should have. By comparison, the most effective of the COVID vaccines are more than 90%. But the yearly flu vaccine is anywhere between 19 to 60% effective, depending on the year. So if this trial shows M72 is at 50% or higher, this could fundamentally change the spread of this deadly disease and impact many people.
It would have huge impact, primarily on sub-Saharan African countries and Southeast Asian countries where the tuberculosis burden is highest. So even a vaccine that has 50% efficacy can save millions of lives and avert tens of millions of cases of TB over let's say a 20 to 30 year trajectory.
But getting the vaccine into people's arms isn't a quick process.
Let's say in South Africa, the Department of Health of South Africa or another country would have to be satisfied that in that particular country that the benefits outweigh the risks. And then there's all the questions of if you roll it out, where do you roll it out to first? And who do you roll it out to first? Yes. Luckily, that's not my decision.
While that is still far down the line, the trial participants in Worcester already know how impactful a vaccine could be.
I know how it can attack someone.
One of the women you heard earlier, Noluthando Mali, recalls her brother nearly dying of TB the second time he was infected.
So when he survived it, we couldn't believe, and we were thanking God because we thought we were going to lose him. We also celebrated. We didn't tell him, and we did a surprise party for his 50th birthday.
Now she hopes the trial will make everyone more safe.
To me, it would mean the best. It would mean a healthier life to us all. So that would mean a healthier community, healthier Worcester, healthier area. So it's the best for me.
Rubenisha believes the protection she might be getting now will make a big impact.
I do think when it's gonna work one day, that this Worcester is gonna be a lovely, lovely world in outside. Because I think then they can give this vaccination is for free, so they can give it to all the people. So then I don't think we have to talk about such diseases, TB again, because it won't be more here.
That's the hope here, that in some way vaccines like the M72 can fundamentally change the impact of deadly infectious diseases, one small town at a time.
That was reporter Elna Schütz. Up next, what else is needed to eliminate TB? More on that after the break. Before the break, we heard about the M72 vaccine trial in South Africa. If it gets approved, it would be the first new TB vaccine in more than a century. We're now back with Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, Principal Advisor on Tuberculosis for the Health Ministry of India. She's speaking with Chhavi Sachdev, a long-time radio journalist based in Mumbai, India. You'll actually hear more from Chhavi in a few episodes. In this conversation, Chhavi asks Soumya which innovations she thinks will help eliminate tuberculosis and why TB remains the deadliest infectious disease.
How do we get the world to be safer from TB? Where are we at with prevention?
I should first say that 1.5 million people die of TB every year globally. And of these, about 27% are in India alone. So we have a very large burden both of TB and TB deaths in India. Obviously, prevention of any infectious disease is the ideal strategy. However, in the case of TB, challenging, because for prevention, you need a tool that works well. And the tools that have worked well for other infectious diseases are usually either a vaccine or a drug. In the case of TB, we do not have a highly efficacious prevention mechanism which also sustains its effect. We know that vaccines, the BCG, which is still used to protect children from severe forms of TB, does not protect adults very well. We, of course, have several vaccines under development, but really none that have been shown to be highly efficacious in preventing, let's say, post-primary TB. For drugs, we know that giving a combination of drugs like isoniazid and rifampicin or rifapentine or similar combinations can help in protecting people from acquiring TB or from it flaring up, but it's not a long-lasting protection. Now, the very interesting development that's recently come out of studies in India is that nutrition is very important for prevention of TB, and the rations trial, which was done in a very poor part of India, in Jharkhand, showed that if you gave high calories and protein, a nutritious diet to the household family members of TB patients, people who are generally at higher risk of acquiring TB, you can actually prevent or reduce the incidence of TB in this group by 50%. Now, this is better than any vaccine that we have currently. So nutrition, it turns out, is actually the best preventive strategy for TB in populations that are malnourished. Of course, this applies to populations that are malnourished. So this is a finding that has now been recommended by the WHO very recently in their most recent update as a strategy to use to prevent TB in vulnerable populations.
That is exciting. Scientifically, though, if we've heard of the M72, are there other TB vaccine candidates with potential that you've heard of?
So there are several TB candidates under development, and there has been a pipeline of TB vaccine candidates for the last few years. So the M72 is one of the first to go into large-scale clinical trial supported by the Gates Foundation in multiple countries across Africa and Asia, and hopefully we have results from that trial in a couple of years. Mm-hmm. There's also a candidate called the MTB-VAC, which has shown some promising results in phase 2 and hopefully can go into phase 3. And then there are a couple of mRNA vaccine candidates, one indigenously developed in India and others also. BioNTech has a TB vaccine candidate, for example. So the mRNA technology is now being used, but again, these are still in very early stage, just going into animal studies or into phase 1 human trials. So they're still a ways away from knowing whether they're going to be safe and efficacious.
What are you most excited about? Is there anything on the horizon that you're hopeful will provide a breakthrough in prophylaxis and prevention of TB?
So a couple of things. One is that we do have this large M72 vaccine trial going on now. And of course, we can't predict what the results are going to be and whether this vaccine will show the efficacy that we'd like to see. But what it will do is also will be to provide a very large database and along with clinical samples, which could then be used to study some of these gaps in knowledge, like the biomarkers of protection, or even looking at people who do get infected and looking at the genomes and trying to figure out, if there are particular markers within the tuberculosis genome that might give some clues on being more protective than others. So we need more clinical trials and more cohort studies, which also collect these biological samples. So I think we're well poised to do that now with the kind of technologies that are available, but we need global collaboration and data sharing, which is going to be very, very important to make progress in this field.
Let's switch to talking about treatment. So if you have a TB diagnosis, what are the challenges in getting better?
First thing, of course, is to have the right diagnosis and to be put on the appropriate treatment. So what I mean is that it's not just enough to have a diagnosis of TB. You need to know what kind of TB bug you're infected with. Is it a drug-resistant bacteria or is it a drug-sensitive one? And if it's resistant, then what antibiotics is it resistant to? So now, again, there are molecular tests and many platforms that are available to rapidly identify drug resistance. The problem is that they're not yet scaled so that they're reaching everybody. So that's challenge number one. The second, of course, is that TB treatment, even for drug sensitive, is long. It's 6 months of treatment. And if any one of us can imagine ourselves taking drugs regularly for 6 months, sometimes having to put up with side effects, there's a pretty large chance that, you would like to stop or take breaks from this treatment, or even just forget or be so preoccupied with work and so on that, you forget to take your medications, particularly after you've started feeling better. So after the first few weeks of treatment. So this is a big problem and a challenge. Lots of people drop out of treatment, and there's also a greater chance of developing drug resistance if the patient is irregular with treatment. Now, social and economic factors play a big role here. And so we can overcome this particular problem by providing more social support to patients during treatment, by staying in touch with them, by providing counseling, by addressing side effects, and so on. The other challenge with TB treatment is that for multi-drug resistant TB, while the currently used drugs combinations are much better and are giving better outcomes than what they used to do in the past, I wouldn't say that we have arrived at the perfect regimen, because the current regimens also have side effects, which sometimes are really quite severe and prevent people from continuing with the treatment. So we do need to continue on the quest to discover new drugs, new drug combinations in particular, and ideally arrive at a state where one drug combination, a new drug combination, can treat all forms of TB.
How far are we from that?
So the good news is that there are several new molecules that have now entered clinical testing and in fact are progressing very well through clinical trials. And so what we do need is this, having at least 2 or 3 new molecules, new classes of drugs, because the problem with TB, of course, is that the classes of drugs we've used in the past, the bacteria has already developed resistance, and in some cases, very high levels of resistance. So what you need constantly are new targets in the TB genome through new classes of drugs that can then be combined. We are on the path to getting there, but it's going to be a few more years before we can have this completely what we call universal drug regimen.
Yeah, from what I've researched and reported on drug-resistant diseases is that it's hard to outpace the disease because the disease is actively challenging existing drugs and mutating faster than we can keep up. And drug discovery takes so long, not just in finding the right molecule, but then all the trials. Is there any way that could change to fast track something, or is there just no safe way to make quicker deliveries reach people who need them?
There are ways to fast track or speed up or accelerate this process. And we saw during COVID that it was possible to really fast track clinical trials and get approvals in record time in multiple countries for new drugs and new vaccines, but also to very quickly find out the drugs that were not effective for COVID so that we don't waste time actually pursuing them or using them for patients. So I think, again, it requires a few ingredients here to make this acceleration possible. One is collaboration. I think we need multi-country collaborations here, platforms, clinical trial platforms that are continuously enrolling TB patients into trials in multiple countries so that as new drugs come in, you just bring them onto this platform and they go through the process very quickly. This requires good coordination. It requires, again, lots of cooperation and agreement to do things jointly in the greater good and sharing data and all of that. It does also require financing. And this is where philanthropy plays a very big role, but also endemic countries, TB endemic countries must also step up their funding for TB research. It also needs agencies like the WHO and regulatory agencies of countries to agree on the pathways that they would use for licensing new drugs or drug combinations so that during COVID, we had globally agreed benchmarks and standards for when regulatory agencies would approve a certain drug. So there was no time lost. So I think if we treat TB like the public health threat that it is, and similar to COVID, where COVID was at its peak, killing more than 1.5 million people every year, now TB has been doing that for so many years and continues to kill 1.5 million people every year, and yet we're not treating it as an emergency for which the world needs to come together and develop solutions.
There's also a gap when it comes to delivering these medicines, isn't it, in terms of both access and cost?
That's right. So there's firstly very little investment by pharma companies in TB drug development. But yes, there are big gaps between finding a drug that's found to be efficacious and then making it accessible. But there are organizations like the TB Alliance that was set up exactly to do that. And then you have UNITAID also working, and then the Global Fund that is willing to support, the large scaling up of any new effective TB medications. So I think we have global mechanisms. The WHO also now has really accelerated the speed of updating its guidelines and recommendations. So very soon after you have a new finding, actually the new treatment guidelines come out. And so I would love to see a world where a new TB drug is not patented at all. It's completely off patent. And from day one, there's technology transfer to a number of generic companies around the world so that the drug can be manufactured at a lower cost, more affordable, at scale, and then distributed to all the countries that actually need it. And that would be the ideal scenario.
What else do you think could eliminate TB? What else do you think could help eliminate TB?
Well, I think on the vaccine front, obviously, I think if we got an effective vaccine, then I think that we could persuade both national governments as well as international agencies to finance and support the scaling up of TB vaccines. I do think that we still need to address the gaps in financing of TB R&D. We're really falling short quite significantly compared to what the world invested in COVID, and particularly COVID vaccines. Not even a fraction of that is going into TB and TB vaccine R&D. We also have shortfalls in implementation for TB programs. And now with the decline in international aid funding, this is actually impacting countries, many low-income countries, very badly. So again, I'm worried that we'll actually see a setback, just like we saw during COVID, that we might actually end up seeing more deaths and more untreated TB cases globally. But in the diagnostics field, we have seen huge innovations and very happy to see so many innovations coming out of India. For example, point-of-care rapid tests using tongue swabs, for example, so you no longer need to take a sputum. We've got now artificial intelligence that works very well when attached to X-rays, portable, small digital X-ray machines that you can take into the community, and combined with AI algorithms, suspect the TB lesions on those X-rays and ensure that those patients then get the molecular testing done on the specimens. So there's been huge progress actually in the early diagnosis of TB. Again, these technologies now need to be scaled for which the cost has to come down, and countries will need to invest actually in scaling up these diagnostics. That's the only way that we're going to be able to find more people out in the community who have TB, treat them, and therefore reduce the transmission of TB.
That was Dr. Soumya Swaminathan speaking with journalist Chhavi Sachdev. Dr. Soumya Swaminathan is currently the Principal Advisor on Tuberculosis for the Health Ministry of India. She's also the head of the MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, a non-profit advancing sustainable rural development and climate change. So far this season, we've covered the power of prevention drugs for ending HIV and how transformative a new TB vaccine could be. But what about malaria? Next time on The Threshold, we'll hear about the biggest breakthroughs in the fight against malaria, a disease that kills nearly 600,000 people every year, largely children under 5. For malaria, the main problem is mosquitoes. But how do you stop them from transmitting malaria? And which tools are the most promising?
These changes will have the effect that these mosquitoes cannot transmit malaria effectively anymore.
All that next week. The Threshold is a production of Foreign Policy, made possible in part through funding from the Gates Foundation. I'm your host, Henry Bonsu, and Elna Schütz contributed reporting to this episode. This podcast is produced by Laura Roseborough-Tellem, who also helped create the show. Rob Sachs is our editor, and Indra Dalasekan provided production assistance. Thanks for listening.